Lepo pozdravljeni.
Allow me to bid a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Franci Avsec. I'm a member of the Cooperative Union of Slovenia. I will briefly talk about the history and contemporary period when it comes to cooperatives in Slovenia. As far as cooperatives are concerned, Slovenia also have a long-standing history. We also have our own tradition, yet development was interrupted on a number of occasions, and we can say that we had waves, we had ups and downs. There was a time of great development, then we had many failures, then we went up again. But as a movement and as an organization form, since its inception more than 150 years ago, cooperatives has been confronted with different states, with different forms of development, and it adapted to such changes. So, contemporary period is coupled with the past, and the past is coupled with contemporary period. We have different records, and I can tell you that cooperatives have the so-called intergenerational property. This intergenerational property means that we have been able to address common problems and that cooperative movement has been well developed to address these changes. Of course, this review is far from complete. It is not exhaustive. Probably some will understand this in the wrong way. Still, I will make an attempt to make a brief summary in terms of historical perspective on cooperatives, and I will measure where we stand today. So when it comes to the first period, it is the second part of the 19th century. Farmers were able to perform their work. There were no longer guilds, but still farmers had to pay compensation and they had to pay taxes in order to work the land, and of course they also needed a lot of money in order to do their job. Therefore, they needed a loan. Many exploited this situation with the railways. We had cheap goods coming from Argentina and Russia. They competed with Slovene produce, and of course farmers also lost their income from supply of services, from transport services, etc. So therefore many farmers went bankrupt and they were forced to no longer be farmers, but they were in factories. And many emigrated and of course there was a great problem of national existence and national identity. In order to address these financial problems and other dependencies of that period, we saw the emergence of cooperatives. Credit cooperatives made it possible for farmers, artisans, and workers to have access to these loans, and interest rates were bearable, they were sustainable. Slovene members have also been able to access these documents in the Slovene language, which in the past was not the case. And of course, this created trust and solidarity among members. In turn, these cooperatives successfully operated. But how did they come about in the first place? The first cooperative and the first society was established in 1856 in Ljubljana upon the initiative of artisan Jana Pomuka Horvat. He was of Czech descent. He provided loans to artisans in the region of Ljubljana. At that time, this was an isolated attempt for more than a decade. Then, at the end of the 1860s, Dr. Josip Vošnjak, a doctor, attended a ceremony where they set a foundation stone for the Czech theater in Prague, and then he learned about savings banks, enabling their members to have access to loans. and he published in the journal Slovene Nation as well as the Mohor calendar. He published articles about how to transfer this idea and how to bring this idea to Slovenia. And people were familiar with the concept. His articles were read, but then the government was not in favor of such an idea. He applied on a number of occasions to establish such an institution, but these applications were declined. Once they read rules about the operation of this association, it was decided in the town of Ljutomer in 1872 to establish such an institution, and they also received a consent by the regional authority to set up this formation in 1872. This was followed by a wave of new savings banks providing loans to different towns and cities. So this was the first wave of cooperative movement. And then next year, we had a special act on cooperatives, which is still in force in Austria with some amendments. So this was passed in 1873. There was a different form of cooperative movement. It differed from associations. When it comes to associations, an authority reviewed the application and they said whether it is in the public interest to set up such a society or not. When it comes to cooperatives, however, the registration was in the hands of courts because they had to record every cooperative whether certain conditions are complied with. And this enabled for the cooperative movement to take root in Slovenia. Then there was Vošnjak's brother. His name was Michael Vošnjak. There was an initiative on his part to establish a cooperative in the region of Celje in 1883. So this cooperative union, without any legislation, spontaneously started in 1888, and they performed audits within their cooperatives. This was also the first audit in Slovenia, without having any legislation defining audits in different legal entities. So later on, in the last decade of the 19th century, the center of the cooperative movement, which at that time was in the northeast of Slovenia, transferred to the central part of Slovenia. The initiative was taken over by a Christian socialist and politician organizer. His name was Dr. Janez Evangelist Krek. He made use of the Raiffeisen model. He wrote a book and he learned that money was in fact a divisive factor, which is why they should have a more comprehensive movement of cooperatives. At that time, cooperatives play a very important as well as social role, and practically they made sure that interest rates were given at affordable levels. And this Raiffeisen model of establishment made sure that the model of cooperatives was very successful, and it thrived until the First World War. At that time, Janez Evangelist Krek died because he was too exhausted. Then the third development period, this is the period of the former Yugoslavia, of the Southern Association of Slavs between both world wars. There were, of course, materially difficult conditions. There was a problem of exchange rate of money. Then there was also a problem of political division persisting until the Second World War. And then there was also one important achievement from that period. We had cooperative banks which were newly established. At that time in Austria it was not able to have a concession, but then after the First World War, it was a possibility to establish such banks, and cooperative banks were given a free hand. But there were also a number of problems because of the global recession. Then farmers were increasingly indebted because they had their deposits and loans also with credit banks, calling for reprogramming, standstill period, intervention on the part of the state. Then another important advantage from that period We had the Uniform Comprehensive Act in 1937. So the legislation was harmonized at the state level, and in comparison to a very liberal law from Austria in the 1973, this act was based on solidarity. So cooperatives were regarded as a special form of institution. They also had indivisible property, which even if cooperative cease with its existence, would also be able to get this fund and get this property for funding in the future. Then we have the fourth development period, since the end of the Second World War until Slovenia's independence in 1991. Here we can have four sub-periods. The first period, revolutionary measures in addition to agricultural reforms and nationalization, the liquidation of pre-war cooperatives and banks, and on the other hand, we had supply chains offering cooperatives new avenues to explore. At that time, we had one problem when it comes to development of cooperative movement. This was a minor hiccup. In 1948, 1953, there was an unsuccessful campaign for workers and agricultural cooperatives based on the Soviet model, but this model didn't come to life, and this was probably the reason why there was a decision about a different political system, so that then Yugoslavia dissoluted from the Soviet Union. Then we had the second period from 1953 to 1961, the area marked by social property and self-governance. Here we are coming close to the idea of social companies with self-management, not only on the part of its members but also workers. This was a very important period for further development of the cooperative movement. At that period, the cooperative movement was limited to cooperatives. And then we also had private and public sector. We had artisans, we had farmers. And outside of this production sector, we had cooperatives which catered for housing. And then the third period, non-ownership concepts come to the fore, which had us of this production sector. We had cooperatives which catered for housing. And then the third period, non-ownership concepts come to the fore, which had a severe negative impact on the cooperative movement. Cooperatives lost some of its property and management rights. As for economic policies, it gave a clear priority to profit-making companies at the expense of cooperatives, and slowly but surely it put cooperatives on equal footing with social enterprises. And at that period, when it comes to cooperative unions, they in fact no longer existed. Then that period stops at the end of the 1960s. As a cut-off period, this was the period in the year of 1969. In Slovenia, the Act on Savings Cooperatives for Agricultural and Forestry Association was put in force, whereby these companies had a possibility to organize savings funds, to invest these funds in order for these organizations to develop. And also farms had an opportunity to develop. This gave impetus to modernization of agriculture. In 1971, such center was established. We also had an independent cooperative association, and at the end of this period, we saw the establishment of the Slovene Cooperative Bank, which is today the Slovene Provincial Bank. But at that time, we haven't been able to capitalize on these opportunities for cooperatives to grow, but on the other hand, Slovenia declared independence, and we made a transition to the market economy. And the fifth development period, the current period, it has been characterized by the adoption of the Cooperative Act. Cooperatives are a legal entity in order to give impetus to economic benefits of its members. There was the third amendment passed in 1992. So this act, in fact, fully complies with the purpose which is set out in the regulation 1432/2003. So this is the statute of the European cooperatives. We want to conclude contracts with our members in supply chains. So we talk about sales contracts. When it comes to services, there are contracts to perform and use different services. When it comes to workers' cooperatives, we are dealing with employment contracts. And when it comes to housing cooperatives, how to manage, use and rent out flats and property. When it comes to the cooperative movement, we invested a lot of efforts, and we are still doing so, in order how to best define our identity. We want to determine what are distinctive features of cooperatives and where we differ from other legal entities. If we want to seek the main defining distinctive factor when it comes to cooperatives and other types of organization, I believe this is its identity. We have members on one hand and users of services on the other. So our members are owners of invested capital. They also manage the organization. Members predominantly are the most important business partners of cooperative in the widest possible sense. When it comes to this partnership and membership relations, we also have a definition in line with the Slovene Act, and it consists of 3 layers, or rather 3 levels. So capital investment with stakes and participation when it comes to excess, or rather profit. So when it comes to this management level, members are also in the management board as well as the supervisory board, and transaction levels whereby cooperatives provides benefits to its members. On the other hand, this member would not be able to get these benefits, or if it did, costs would be higher. And then there is one thing which I would like to mention. We're not merely talking about legal transaction between cooperatives and members. We are talking also about mutual insurance. But we are not merely concluding transactions with members, but we are now in a position to perform our basic mission, namely to promote basic interests of our members, and we are entering into legal relations with other third parties. So, for example, if farmers have produce, then cooperatives has to process these products, and they place these products on the market. This is very important for the mission of cooperatives, which is very similar to our basic mission and basic interests and transactions we enter into with our members. And what is of interest to us is also to note then we should not perform transactions which are characterized by sole traders. But the question is, where is the limit of this promotion? On the other hand, cooperatives compete at the market. They compete among each other and between different parties. So in order to be successful at the market, they need to have at least equal condition and benefits, or at least they should enjoy the equal status when compared to other types of companies. And of course, what is the most important thing to note? The most important treasure of the cooperative movement is indeed its members, because benefits can only be boosted as long as all the members cooperate with cooperatives. And what is important to note is for these members to be experts, to be willing to cooperate, to be willing to develop. And this has to be upgraded even further. Of course, cooperatives should be more successful at the market when compared to other types of organization and development. But in order for cooperatives to be successful, we need to know how this is accepted, evaluated by its members. When it comes to the Cooperatives Act, this is a general act enabling members to have wide autonomy. We have very general provisions in line with our rules, and these members adapt these rules. Just briefly, by way of conclusion, you can see my last slide. I will present a couple of numerical data on cooperatives in Slovenia. The latest available data from our records reveal that on the 31st of December 2011, 352 cooperatives were registered in Slovenia. Well, this is not a lot if we compare this to the most developed type of organization, so limited liability company. But we need to be very careful because they have different forms, for example, personal companies, then companies developed by sole traders, which only have one member. So if we actually compare the actual economic weight, relevance, turnover, added value of cooperatives, the ratio between individual types of companies would have been different. But unfortunately, I don't have this segregated data on different types of companies. Our statistical offices do not collect such data, and such data is not being published. Then the second chart, the number of registered and operating cooperatives. Here you can see that there are certain deviations. But in fact, we can say that all registered cooperatives publish their yearly records and they do operate. You can see that the majority of cooperatives can be found in the area of agriculture and forestry as well as trade. So our cooperative movement is market-oriented. It is connected with the emergence of small producers such as farmers who place their products on the market. Because the property structure in Slovenia is extremely fragmented, which is why small farmers have a possibility to be more successful if they join forces with cooperatives. As for the income and turnover, trade is predominant, but we need to consider also one thing. Namely, as far as income is concerned, we have differences. And it is very difficult to compare trade and the economic relevance of trade with other sectors. But, of course, these indicators cannot be found. Probably added value would be differently defined. And the last chart, the structure of liabilities within the cooperative sector. Although this asset lock, of course, is not always defined because this is not a rule. Here we need to consider past generations as well, but this data is not available always. As for annual reports, they are tailor-made to suit the needs of investors and for profit-making companies. Therefore, they are not in a position to reveal the specific features of the cooperative sector and its role, which is not just economic, but is also social and green. So when assessing this qualitative data, we need to be extremely careful, which is why the description and interpretation of the cooperative movement should be left to qualitative indicators as well as stories, which we will hear today and tomorrow. They are even more important when it comes to the promotion of the cooperative sector, and they are more important than merely statistical data on the standard classification of activities. Thank you very much for your